What Rousseau wants, of course, is something much more radical. He's imagining, at the least, a transformation of the human being and of human society that's possible and that would go a long way towards getting rid of not all the evils in the world, but towards recasting the human being altogether. And to do that, of course, you need an explanation of evil. Kant called Rousseau the Newton of the mind, which is a very, very interesting title because in the 18th century, everybody wanted to be the Newton of the mind. Everybody wanted to be another Newton. And that shows a couple of things. One is Newton was just valorized. He was the hero. He was the pinnacle of intellectual achievement. But also, physics at that point in time wasn't really seen as a separate part of human knowledge in the way that it is now. It was all sort of a continuum. So what was the idea of becoming the Newton of the mind? Well, it was just understanding the world in a marvelous, deep, conceptually changing way. So being able to connect something as apparently unconnected as the moon and the tides, which just seemed to be two different spheres. So everybody wanted to come up with another great set of discoveries the way that Newton had. And having dealt with the cosmos, of course, the next thing that people felt ought to be dealt with was the human mind or the human soul. So everyone wanted to be the next Newton. Hume wanted to be the next Newton. He wrote about it quite clearly. And the only person whom Kant ever called the Newton of the mind was Rousseau. It's an extraordinary statement. And as far as I know, nobody succeeded in explaining it until you think about the problem of evil. What was especially important for Kant in calling Rousseau the Newton of the mind were two books that Rousseau wrote. The first was called The Discourse on Natural Inequality. And that book is an attempt to replace the story of the fall in Genesis with a naturalistic version of how human beings were originally and how we got from this original, rather primitive, golden state, not golden, but a fine state, to the mess that we're in now, without telling any stories about eating apples and snakes and things like that. And essentially he describes the descent from this primitive, simple, rather isolated life into the kind of anarchic and often warlike situation that we're in now as a series of mistakes. Right? We don't need evil intention there in particular. We just need a series of mistakes to explain how, well, division of labor looked like a good idea at the time, but in fact it led to people dividing themselves, their interests, their talents, and some people working in rather machine-like ways and other people not working at all. It all seemed like a harmless, efficient, good idea at the time, but this is what happened. Or private property, ownership of land, seemed like it made sense at the time to put a fence around a piece of land and say this is mine, but actually, Rousseau says, of course, it led to all kinds of disastrous inequalities. Now, when he wrote this, Voltaire sent him the only letter that Voltaire ever wrote, and it was about as snide as a letter could be. He said, "I've received, monsieur, your new book against mankind. Rarely has anything made me feel like crawling around on all fours, but unfortunately, since I lost that gait 60 years ago, I'll prefer to remain as I am." Now, Voltaire thereby started a reading of Rousseau, which is completely false, but it was convenient, and a lot of people read him this way, as being primitive and as arguing that we would all be better off in the state of nature and that we actually ought to return to it. This is not actually what Rousseau thought, but when he wrote the book, he didn't have an alternative. So what he's doing is describing a decline of civilization or decline of the human being, and when people wrote to him and asked, well, do you have any suggestions for a cure? He said, you don't call the doctor when the patient's dead. Now, which is a pretty grim view. But 7 years later, he wrote the book Emile, which he described as his brightest book and his favorite book. The story goes, by the way, that Kant only interrupted his afternoon walk for 2 events. Kant lived a very, very regular life. This is what he said was necessary for him to get so much work done. And only twice in his life did he refrain from taking his afternoon walk at the proper time. Once was in 1780, I think it was 1789 when they stormed the Bastille. It was some event in the French Revolution, and that threw him. But some 25 years before that, when he read the Emile, he also sat and couldn't stop reading, and after that the only picture he had in his house was a picture of Rousseau. Okay. Now, what's exciting about this book, this is the book it's the first child-raising manual. It's way before Dr. Spock. It describes how you should raise an infant from birth up until the time that he gets married. What he did, which, again, we all take for granted now, but it was completely revolutionary at the time he did it, what he did was to connect the way children are raised with the way that societies are built. People didn't focus on children, they didn't focus on psychology, I mean, it's not entirely true. Of course, you have in Plato discussions of how children should be raised in order to ensure a good state. But in a modern sense, no one had thought about how children are raised, how societies are built, and how the earliest human beings might have been created so as to be not benevolent, good, and kind, which is a misreading of Rousseau that virtually everybody comes up with, but how they were simply amoral. They weren't evil, okay? Human beings were not born in original sin. They were just born without being either immoral or moral in particular, but they have an inborn sense of pity. And if you allow children to develop in natural ways, if you support them in certain kinds of ways, rather than trying to force them into an unnatural kind of narcissism, into seeing themselves in other people's eyes, you could raise whole human beings who were free, self-confident, and not cruel, not vain, and not interested in power. Okay? Now, you'd still have earthquakes. In fact, Rousseau starts with the traditional problem of evil, and he says absolutely nothing of any interest about earthquakes. So you'd still have natural evils. But you would have gone a long way towards curing moral evils and changing both the human beings and the character of society. Again, this is not the idea of radical social engineering. It's not that you would have to completely change people from what they are. It's the idea that we are born fairly blank, not entirely blank, but fairly blank. Just for an example of ways in which he connected things that nobody had thought about connecting. He says, if you read children idiotic fables and you make them sit still and listen to baby talk, and he said a nurse's prattle, what you're training them to, and if you teach them stupid things in school, you're training them to sit still and listen to the idiotic lies of politicians.